Welcome to Executive Insights. My guest today is Ainsley D'Mello, Vice President, Enterprise Infrastructure and Operations with CI Global Asset Management. In this episode, Ainsley talks about why he's taking an outcome based approach to driving a collaborative and productive culture. We explore how the role of IT has evolved at CI in enabling workplace and workforce engagement and preparing for the next pandemic like crisis. We also discuss the topic of getting comfortable with the uncomfortable, and Ainsley shares a personal example of why trying something new is important for growth. Hi, Ainsley. Great to see you, and thanks for joining me today.
Hi, Nasheen. Good to see you too. Thanks for inviting me.
Ainsley, one of the biggest shifts in the financial services industry since the pandemic is culture, driven by the sudden and massive migration of the workforce from a physical to a digital space. The face to face and hierarchical culture has really been shaken to its core. As a senior leader, how do you navigate and continue to build trust with your team?
Right. Yeah, it's a good question. I think it's not just about financial services. You're seeing quite a bit of this across multiple industries. But from my focus, I've always been about focusing on outcomes. And when you focus on outcomes, it's somewhat irrelevant for the most part where your employees are. The focus is really about doing what you need to do to get the outcomes completed. In my role specifically in this scenario is to make sure I shape those expectations around the outcomes, but also the most important part is around removing blockers for those outcomes. I think as we go from a physical environment to a virtual environment, the key around all of this is just around communication. And it's pretty simple for me to say that, we don't have face-to-face communication, we go to a virtual communication. But the key in this scenario is finding the proper modes for communication and understanding how you want to get that message across, but also how the receiver wants to receive that message. So it's kind of like a lot of things in life. It's one size doesn't fit all, and understanding how you want to communicate and what you want to communicate and understanding the receiver. So that's where I think that we have, achieved. Let's call it excellence. I'll use the word excellence, excellence around how we've executed through this pandemic currently. But again, excellence also means that we continue to learn and we continue to adapt as we go through this.
Well said. So outcome-based approach and really focusing on communication, and those are the keys here.
Correct.
Despite the prime and proper perception of the industry, you've always been quite entrepreneurial in your leadership style and very much focusing on driving a inclusive and laid-back culture. How does this approach correlate with employee engagement, performance, and outcomes? Can you give me an example?
Right. So I think the way I describe this laid back culture is about being yourself. And as you become being more yourself, you're much more comfortable, and it allows employees to actually execute. And I think my experience has been is was people are more comfortable. That's where you get the performance. That's where you get the better engagement. That's where you get the better outcomes. One of the big things I want to address around this idea of laid back culture is that sometimes it's aligned to where people think it's that we're lazy or that we're just doing the bare minimum to get by. But for me, this laid back attitude is about creating a level of comfort for people. And as people become more comfortable, they're able to execute and deliver more. And for me, I have this big view in life about, we want to execute with pace and create outcomes with pace. And this is one element of how we actually allow to create that pace is to create comfort level. So I'll give you a personal example because I've worked with a lot of people and people have different examples of how they're laid back. I'm a pretty laid back person, just as a general statement, and I've always been that way. I tend to work in I sometimes I'll work in my couch, and sometimes I'll do video conferencing call on my couch, because what that translates, it makes other people feel comfortable. And when other people are comfortable, they're much more open. And I tend to love to try to push people past what they think their current expectations are. And when they're comfortable, that allows them to get to that point.
So when you feel completely comfortable, you're really at your best.
Exactly. Yeah.
Obviously, the leadership element is very important in driving a great culture. And I always believe that culture is the behaviors of the leadership. And another important element for fostering a collaborative culture is technology. How has the role of technology evolved at CI, especially in the recent month?
Right. Yeah. So this notion of everyone going to the office to and then moving towards a more mobile view has allowed some of these enabling technologies that were there in the past that were viewed as a kind of a nice to have and moved to a must have. So things like moving from a mobile user compute, so going from desktops to laptops, and that's at the most basic level, but improving the connectivity experience. So the old days of using RSA tokens, putting numbers in, those things which are not as convenient as when you're in the office is changing, but also on mobile delivery on technology is an area that I think that is changing, especially in CI. And I think of those three areas of the cornerstones of mobile delivery. But I think we can't avoid the conversation around collaboration technology and the collaboration technology that continues to evolve. And it's almost like it's every day that Zoom or Microsoft is posting out new features. And I think it's really good because as we find gaps in how we communicate and how things change, we're constantly evolving this technology. And we're at a point where it's not like it would take months to execute on a gap. We're talking about 3 or 4 days, and we could have a fix that comes out. But I think the other interesting part is that we have the big typical companies, Microsoft and Zoom, that are out there. We also a lot of the smaller organizations that are filling niche gaps around whether it's whiteboard collaboration technology or whether it's cross-bridge technology that's helping bridge that communication gap. So for us, generally thematically, we're looking at a more mobile user approach, and that will definitely help us in the current state, but it'll definitely help us in the future around how we deliver mobile service and mobile technology.
Great insight. And I think another topic I like to explore is, human nature. Oftentimes, we think we learned the lesson and then we quickly move on to the next priority or the next challenge. But you mentioned something that's really interesting last time we spoke. You and your senior leadership team are focusing on preparing the next pandemic like crisis. Can you elaborate on that?
Yeah, I think for us, I mean, we already talked briefly about workspace and workforce technology, and that's obviously a massively key component. But right now, my focus is strongly on execution of cloud delivery and cloud migration, and it's just really about risk mitigation and focusing on that model. And obviously cloud is a strong enabler for digital transformation, and that's what we're focused on right now. And I think that is a key portion of how we're trying to mitigate the impact from the next pandemic. And again, I mean, it's pretty clear that the pandemic is something that we have to always be prepared for, but it could deviate in one way and it could deviate in a totally different way. So it could be worse, or it could be not as bad as the one we had. But I think that having the agility, introducing agile technology that will allow us to actually execute is something that we need to focus on, and we are focusing on. And I know they're talking to other companies that they're doing the same thing as well. So
Yeah. And I agree. We spoke a lot about leadership and technology. And what I also found fascinating from our last conversation was that you said growing up, you had always been a very strong individual contributor and showing little interest in leading until at the very early stage of your career and someone give you a nudge to try something new. And I think this experience may resonate with many in that it's not just about wanting to be a leader, it's really about the courage to try something new and push yourself out of the comfort zone. What have you learned from putting your hand up for the first time? And what sort of advice can you offer to people who are afraid of trying something new?
right. Yeah, I think you kind of touched on this. Is just it's really about forcing yourself out of that comfort zone, and it's really easy for somebody to say, "Well, you should put your hand up and you should always try something different," but it can be difficult. And I think the big thing that will enable people to do this is having a good support system. So whether that's family or whether that's other coworkers or colleagues that you worked with in the past, is kind of always ping ideas off them. And I think for the most part is you have a good support system to help you move across. But I think the big thing for me has always been that I always want to grow. I always want to learn new things. And you can be really good at what you're good at, but if you really want to expand your horizons, you need to start doing things that you may not think you're good at, because you probably will be good at it. And it's probably pretty rare that you're going to be bad at something. But even if you are, it's a lesson that you can use in the future. And it's also an area where you can go ahead and continue to improve. Because like as always said before, it's really easy to improve your strengths, but it's much more difficult to improve your weaknesses. So that's kind of my view on what I've done. And yeah, I mean, I wasn't really a big, my career wasn't focused on being a leader. My career was focused on contributions, but it's really about the fact that, doing something different and moving forward through there has been key for me.
Well said. Well, Ainsley, I really enjoyed this conversation. Thank you so much for all your insight and perspectives.
Thanks, Nasheen. It was great talking to you again.
You've been watching another episode of Executive Insights by the IT Media Group. Thank you for tuning in. If you enjoyed this video, please check out other CIO and leadership-centric content on our YouTube channel. And don't forget to subscribe